Autumn of 1983 was unusually cold in Pine Hollow, a small, secluded town nestled deep in the Appalachian Mountains. The vibrant oranges and reds of the foliage seemed muted that year, as if nature itself was holding its breath. Elias Grayson, 32 years old and a lifelong resident, cherished the solitude of his small-town life. He worked as a mechanic at Caleb Ward's garage, a modest shop that rarely saw much excitement. That was about to change. It began with the disappearance of 18-year-old Kimberly Walsh. She'd gone camping near Whispering Falls with her friends to celebrate graduation. Her friends claimed she wandered off in the middle of the night and never returned. By the following morning, the search parties were organized, and Sheriff Josiah Crane was knocking on every door in town, asking for volunteers. Elias and Caleb joined the search the next morning, equipped with flashlights, water, and a nervous determination. They were assigned to a section of the forest alongside Tom Hawkins, the local hunting guide, and his dog Buster. As the group ventured deeper into the woods, the usual sounds of chirping birds and rustling leaves grew eerily quiet. It wasn't long before Buster froze, nose to the ground, and let out a low, trembling whine. "What is it, boy?" Tom crouched to examine the tracks Buster had found. Elias and Caleb peered over his shoulder. The footprints were massive, too large for a human but too oddly shaped for any known animal. The stride was unnervingly long, almost as if the creature had been running on all fours. Tom's face darkened. This ain't right. "What are you saying?" Caleb asked, his voice shaking. Tom straightened up, scanning the tree line. "I'm saying we need to be careful. Something's out here, and it's not a bear." The group pressed on, though unease gnawed at Elias. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest took on a menacing quality. Shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, playing tricks on his mind. They reached a clearing where Kimberly's campsite had been. A burnt-out fire pit and scattered belongings told a grim story. Caleb found a piece of torn fabric snagged on a thorny bush, the same shade as Kimberly's jacket. Elias crouched beside the bush, running his fingers over the fabric. She was here, recently. Before Tom could respond, Buster started growling, his fur bristling as he stared into the dark woods beyond the clearing. "Buster, what is it?" Tom whispered, gripping his rifle. A guttural growl, low and reverberating, answered from the trees. The sound sent chills down Elias's spine. It wasn't the growl of any animal he'd ever heard. This was deeper, more primal, almost intelligent. "We're not alone," Tom muttered, his grip tightening on the rifle. The group huddled closer, flashlights darting across the trees. Then, something moved. A shadow, impossibly large, darted between the trees with inhuman speed. "There!" Caleb shouted, raising his flashlight. But whatever it was had already vanished. The growl came again, this time from behind them. The group spun around, but the darkness seemed alive, pressing in on all sides. "Back to town," Tom ordered, his voice firm. "Now." They retraced their steps, hearts pounding with every snap of a twig or rustle of leaves. The feeling of being watched was suffocating. They reached the edge of the woods just as the last light of day faded, but the sense of unease followed them back to Pine Hollow. That night, Elias couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the shadowy figure darting through the trees, felt the weight of unseen eyes watching him. A loud bang jolted him upright. It came from the garage. Throwing on a jacket, Elias grabbed a flashlight and headed out. The night was deathly still, the air heavy with tension. As he approached the garage, he saw the front door ajar, swaying slightly in the breeze. "Caleb?" he called out, his voice barely above a whisper. No answer. Elias stepped inside, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the darkness. Tools lay scattered on the floor, and the air was thick with the metallic tang of blood. Then he saw it, a deep scratch gouged into the metal wall, as if something with massive claws had raked across it. A sound behind him made him spin around. There, in the shadows, two glowing eyes stared back at him. They were unlike anything he'd ever seen, burning with an unnatural light, both predatory and malicious. Before he could react, the creature lunged. Elias barely managed to dodge, the beast's claws missing him by inches. He caught a brief glimpse of its grotesque form, hunched and muscular, with elongated limbs and matted fur. Its face was almost human, but twisted, with sharp, jagged teeth that gleamed in the dim light. Elias bolted out of the garage, the creature's guttural growl echoing behind him. He ran to Caleb's house, banging on the door until his friend answered, bleary-eyed. "Elias? What the hell?" "It's here," Elias gasped. "The thing from the woods. It's in the garage." Caleb grabbed a shotgun, and the two hurried back. The garage was silent, the door still ajar. Inside, they found nothing but the scattered tools and claw marks. "I swear it was here," Elias insisted. Caleb nodded grimly. "I believe you. We need to tell the sheriff." The next day, Sheriff Crane and a team of deputies investigated the garage. They found the claw marks, but dismissed them as damage from an animal, likely a bear or cougar. Elias knew better. That night, the creature returned. This time, it targeted the Carson family's farm on the outskirts of town. Livestock were found mutilated, their bodies arranged in grotesque patterns. Panic spread through Pine Hollow. Sheriff Crane imposed a curfew, and search parties scoured the woods for the beast. But as the days turned into weeks, the attacks only grew bolder. People began reporting sightings, shadowy figures at the edge of their property, glowing eyes watching from the darkness. Elias, Caleb, and Sheriff Crane decided to confront the creature head-on. They tracked its movements to an abandoned mine deep in the forest. The air inside was suffocating, thick with the stench of decay. They found the beast in a cavern, hunched over a fresh kill. It turned to face them, its glowing eyes narrowing. Sheriff Crane fired the first shot, and the creature let out a blood-curdling roar. The battle was chaos. Bullets seemed to barely slow the beast, its movements unnaturally fast. Elias managed to land a blow with a length of rusted pipe, but the creature retaliated, slashing his back. In the end, it was Caleb's shotgun blast to the creature's face that brought it down. The beast let out a final guttural growl before collapsing. As the men approached its body, the fur began to recede, the limbs shrinking and reshaping. Within moments, the monstrous creature was gone, replaced by the lifeless body of Gregory Simmons, the man who had stumbled into town weeks ago, warning of the beast. Elias stared in horror. The nightmare wasn't over. It had just begun. It was the summer of 1989 when Aaron Blake, a 29-year-old wildlife photographer, set off for Blackthorn Creek, a remote wilderness in the heart of Montana. The trip was supposed to be a respite from the suffocating city life of Seattle. Aaron had grown tired of traffic jams and constant deadlines. He craved silence, the kind only a deep forest could offer. But what he found at Blackthorn Creek wasn't peace. It was terror. Aaron arrived at the trailhead in the early afternoon. The forest was dense and vibrant, the air thick with the earthy scent of pine and moss. The gentle babbling of Blackthorn Creek accompanied him as he ventured deeper into the woods. It was perfect, almost too perfect. By the time he reached a clearing beside the creek to set up camp, the sun was beginning its descent, casting long golden rays through the canopy. He pitched his tent, lit a small fire, and sat by the water with his camera, capturing the ethereal beauty of the place. As night fell, the forest came alive with the sounds of crickets, frogs, and the occasional rustle of small animals in the underbrush. It was exactly what Aaron had hoped for, until the whispers began. It started faintly, so faint he thought it was the wind, but as the hours dragged on, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They seemed to come from every direction, soft voices speaking a language he couldn't understand. Aaron tried to convince himself it was just the rustling leaves or distant wildlife. Still, he couldn't shake the creeping dread that someone, or something, was out there, watching him. Gripping his flashlight, he stepped out of his tent and scanned the darkened forest. "Hello?" he called, his voice trembling. The whispers stopped abruptly, plunging the woods into an eerie silence. Aaron's heart pounded in his chest as he swept the beam of light across the trees. Nothing moved, but the silence was more unsettling than the whispers. After a tense few minutes, Aaron retreated to his tent, locking the zipper as if it could keep the unknown at bay. He lay awake, every nerve on edge, until exhaustion finally claimed him. Aaron awoke to the sound of splashing. Dawn's first light was breaking through the trees, and Blackthorn Creek shimmered in its golden glow. He stepped out of his tent, camera in hand, ready to capture the serene beauty of the morning, but his breath caught in his throat. There, in the creek, stood a figure, a woman in a pale, tattered dress. Her back was to him, her long, dark hair dripping water as she swayed gently. "Ma'am?" Aaron called cautiously, stepping closer. She didn't respond. As he moved nearer, he noticed something strange. The water around her was still, unnaturally so, as if time had frozen in that one spot. Aaron's stomach churned with unease. "Are you okay?" he asked again, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman turned slowly, and Aaron stumbled back in horror. Her face was pale and hollow, her eyes black voids that seemed to swallow the light. Her lips twisted into a chilling smile as she raised a finger to her lips. "Shh," The sound paralyzed him. Before he could react, she vanished, her form dissolving into the water like smoke. Aaron packed his camp in record time. He told himself it was a hallucination brought on by lack of sleep or stress, but the image of her face was burned into his mind. He resolved to head back to his car and leave Blackthorn Creek behind. As he retraced his steps along the trail, the forest seemed different. The cheerful chirping of birds and rustling leaves had been replaced by an oppressive quiet. Shadows stretched unnaturally long, and every step felt heavier, as if the forest itself was trying to hold him back. It wasn't long before he realized he was lost. The trail, which had been clear the day before, seemed to twist and vanish into the trees. Panic clawed at him as he tried to navigate by landmarks he no longer recognized. "Stay calm," he muttered to himself, pulling out his map. But no matter how carefully he studied it, nothing matched his surroundings. Then he heard it, the whispers again, louder now, insistent. They didn't fade this time but grew closer, circling him like a pack of predators. Aaron turned wildly, trying to pinpoint their source, but all he could see were trees. "Leave me alone," he shouted, his voice cracking. The whispers stopped. For a moment, there was silence, and Aaron dared to hope he'd scared whatever it was away. Then a guttural voice, deep and raspy, spoke from the shadows. "You shouldn't have come here." Aaron spun around, his flashlight beam catching a fleeting glimpse of something inhuman, a tall, gaunt figure with elongated limbs and glowing eyes. It darted between the trees faster than his eyes could follow. "Who are you? What do you want?" Aaron demanded, his voice trembling. The voice laughed, a sound that made his blood run cold. "You trespassed, and now you belong to us." Aaron turned and ran, branches clawing at his clothes and face as he tore through the underbrush. The whispers rose around him again, joined by the sound of footsteps, too many to count, chasing him. He didn't stop until he stumbled into a clearing and saw it. A massive, twisted tree at the center, its gnarled roots forming a grotesque, unnatural pattern. Strange symbols were carved into the bark, glowing faintly in the dim light. Aaron felt drawn to it, an unnatural pull he couldn't resist. As he approached, the whispers reached a crescendo, and the shadows around him seemed to ripple and shift. The woman from the creek appeared again, stepping out from behind the tree. Her face was still hollow, her eyes still empty, but this time she wasn't alone. Dozens of shadowy figures emerged from the woods, surrounding him. "Join us," she whispered, her voice like dry leaves in the wind. Aaron shook his head, backing away. "Number, I'm leaving." The figures closed in, their forms shifting and melting into the shadows. The woman reached out, her cold, skeletal fingers brushing his arm. Pain shot through him, and he collapsed to the ground, darkness closing in around him. When Aaron awoke, it was morning. He was lying at the edge of Blackthorn Creek, his camera beside him. The forest was peaceful again, the air filled with birdsong and the gentle rustle of leaves. For a moment, he thought it had all been a nightmare. Then he saw the marks on his arm, blackened veins spreading out from where the woman had touched him. They pulsed faintly, as if alive. Aaron stumbled back to his car and left Blackthorn Creek without looking back. But even miles away, he could still hear the whispers, faint but ever present, reminding him that the forest wasn't done with him yet, and neither were they. In the autumn of 1995, Whispering Pines, a small and secluded town surrounded by dense forest, was a haven for those seeking escape from the chaos of modern life. Nestled in the heart of Montana, it boasted untouched wilderness, winding trails, and an eerie tranquility that locals cherished. Yet beneath its serene facade, the woods harbored a dark secret, a secret that would soon claim 29-year-old Harper Lane's sense of normalcy. Harper was a wildlife photographer, drawn to the town's unspoiled beauty and the promise of capturing rare and elusive creatures on film. She rented a rustic cabin on the outskirts of Whispering Pines, its back porch overlooking a stretch of forest so thick it seemed impenetrable. For weeks she roamed the woods with her camera, finding solace in the solitude. But as October crept in, the atmosphere grew heavy, and Harper began to notice strange things. It started with the whispers. At first she dismissed them as the rustling of leaves or the distant calls of wildlife, but soon the sounds became distinct, soft, unintelligible murmurs that seemed to emanate from the shadows. They followed her, growing louder the deeper she ventured into the woods. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon and painted the sky with hues of amber and crimson, Harper stood by her tripod, focused on capturing the perfect shot of the setting sun. The forest behind her was silent, unnervingly so. Suddenly she heard it, a low, guttural growl, followed by the unmistakable crunch of footsteps on fallen leaves. Harper froze. "Hello?" she called out, her voice wavering. The only response was the sound of branches snapping. Heart pounding, she turned and aimed her flashlight into the trees. The beam of light illuminated nothing but trunks and undergrowth. Gripping her flashlight tightly, she packed up her gear and hurried back to the cabin. That night, sleep eluded her. Every creak of the floorboards and groan of the wind sent her heart racing. In the morning, she decided to explore the forest near her cabin, determined to find a logical explanation for the strange noises. As she wandered deeper into the woods, Harper came across something that made her stomach churn, a circle of symbols etched into the dirt, surrounding a pile of charred bones. They were small, almost childlike, and arranged in an unsettlingly deliberate pattern. Her breath quickened as she took photographs, her hands trembling. The whispers began again, faint at first, then louder. This time they were accompanied by a sensation, a cold, oppressive presence that made her skin crawl. The wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of decay. Feeling watched, Harper backed away from the symbols, nearly tripping over a root. Her camera slipped from her hands and hit the ground. As she bent to retrieve it, she saw something move in her peripheral vision, a tall, shadowy figure, standing motionless among the trees. She spun around, but it was gone. Rushing back to her cabin, Harper locked every door and window. She uploaded the photos to her laptop, zooming in on the symbols. They resembled ancient runes, though their meaning was lost to her. She scoured the internet for answers, stumbling upon a local legend, the Shadow of Whispering Pines. The story told of a malevolent entity that stalked the forest, feeding on the fear of those who wandered too far into its domain. According to the tale, the shadow was drawn to those who lingered in the woods after dark, marking them as its prey. Harper dismissed it as folklore meant to scare campers, but the uneasy feeling in her gut refused to fade. That night the whispers returned, louder than ever. They seemed to seep through the walls of her cabin, wrapping around her like a cold embrace. Then came the tapping, a slow, deliberate knock on her window. Harper's blood turned to ice as she stared at the curtains, too afraid to move. "Who's there?" she called out, her voice barely above a whisper. The tapping stopped, replaced by a low, raspy laugh. Gathering her courage, Harper grabbed her camera and slowly approached the window. Pulling back the curtain, she saw nothing but her own pale reflection. Yet when she looked down, her breath caught. On the windowsill was a fresh handprint, larger than any human hand, with long, spindly fingers. The next morning, Harper visited the town library, desperate for answers. She pored over old newspaper clippings and books on local history. A headline from 1978 caught her attention. "Local hikers vanish without a trace in Whispering Pines." The accompanying article described a group of 4 friends who disappeared in the same woods Harper now called home. Their belongings were found, but their bodies were never recovered. "Looking for ghost stories?" an older librarian asked, startling Harper. "Something like that," Harper replied, showing her the article. The librarian's expression darkened. "You're not the first to ask about those woods. Folks say they're cursed." "Cursed how?" "Strange disappearances, sightings of things that shouldn't exist. People hear whispers, see shadows that don't belong. If I were you, I'd leave while you still can." Harper nodded, but remained silent. She wasn't ready to abandon her work, not without finding the truth. That evening, armed with a flashlight, camera, and a knife for protection, Harper returned to the forest. She retraced her steps to the circle of runes, determined to document more evidence. As the sun set, the forest seemed to shift, the trees twisting unnaturally in the dim light. The whispers returned, louder than ever, their words just beyond comprehension. Harper felt a cold breath on the back of her neck and spun around, coming face to face with the shadow. It stood over 7 feet tall, its form shifting like smoke. Its eyes burned with an otherworldly light, and its gnarled hands ended in razor-sharp claws. Harper stumbled backward, snapping pictures as the creature advanced. Its presence was suffocating, its whispers now a deafening roar in her mind. Just as the creature lunged, Harper's flashlight flickered and went out. In total darkness, she felt its claws graze her arm, drawing blood. Screaming, she lashed out with the knife, meeting resistance as the blade connected with something solid. The shadow let out an unearthly shriek, retreating into the darkness. Harper didn't wait to see if it would return. She ran, adrenaline propelling her forward. Branches clawed at her face and arms as she sprinted through the forest, her cabin's lights a distant beacon. She burst through the door, locking it behind her, and collapsed onto the floor, gasping for air. In the days that followed, Harper reviewed her photos. They were blurry and grainy, but one stood out, a single haunting image of the shadow, its glowing eyes piercing through the darkness. She sent the photo to experts and paranormal researchers, but no one could explain what it was. Unable to shake the fear that the shadow was still watching, Harper packed her belongings and left Whispering Pines. She vowed never to return, but the whispers stayed with her, haunting her dreams. Even now, years later, Harper glances over her shoulder whenever she walks alone, half expecting to see glowing eyes staring back at her from the shadows. In the bitter winter of 1986, Red Hollow, a remote town nestled in the snow-laden peaks of Montana, was veiled in an eerie quiet. The once vibrant community of loggers and their families had become subdued over the past month. People whispered of disappearances and strange occurrences in the surrounding forest, yet for 34-year-old Henry Carver, a reclusive former park ranger, the rumors felt like the usual superstitions that thrived in such isolated places. Henry lived alone on the outskirts of town, his cabin perched near the edge of Red Hollow Forest. Retired after a tragic accident years ago, he had traded the excitement of ranger duty for the solitude of the wilderness. However, even he couldn't ignore the unease that crept through the town like a shadow. It all started when two teenagers, Amy Foster and Daniel Greaves, vanished after a late-night dare to visit Black Creek Bridge, a site locals avoided. Search parties found no trace of them. No footprints in the snow, no discarded belongings, nothing but the bridge itself, which had become a chilling symbol of their disappearance. One frigid evening, Henry sat by the fire in his cabin, a cup of coffee warming his hands, when the sound of heavy knocking shattered the silence. He opened the door to find Sheriff Eleanor Hayes, her face pale and drawn beneath her wide-brimmed hat. "Henry, I need your help," she said, her breath clouding in the icy air. Henry frowned. "What's going on?" Sheriff Hayes hesitated, then stepped inside, the warmth of the cabin barely softening the tension in her expression. "Another disappearance. This time it's old Mr. Grady. He went out hunting yesterday and never came back." Henry shook his head, setting his coffee down. "You think it's connected to the others?" "I know it is," Hayes replied, lowering her voice. "And I'm afraid whatever's out there, it's not natural." The sheriff's words hung heavy in the air. Henry had heard the whispers around town, of strange howls in the forest at night, shadows that moved against the grain of the trees, and a lingering smell of sulfur near the sites of the disappearances. He dismissed them as hysteria, but now, looking into the sheriff's haunted eyes, he began to reconsider. "What do you need from me?" he asked finally. "Your expertise," Hayes said, "and someone I can trust." The two set out early the next morning, armed with rifles, flashlights, and Henry's old ranger gear. A heavy fog blanketed the forest, muffling sound and turning the towering pines into looming silhouettes. The stillness was unnerving. Even the birds seemed to have abandoned the area. They reached the edge of Black Creek Bridge, the last known location of the missing teenagers. The bridge, an old wooden structure spanning a narrow gorge, creaked under their weight as they crossed. Henry stopped in the middle, scanning the surrounding woods with his binoculars. "Do you smell that?" Hayes asked suddenly, wrinkling her nose. Henry inhaled and froze. The air carried a sharp, acrid scent, like burnt hair mixed with decaying flesh. It was faint, but unmistakable. Before he could respond, a noise echoed from the trees, a deep guttural growl that reverberated through the gorge. Henry and Hayes exchanged a tense glance. "That didn't sound like a wolf," Henry muttered. They followed the sound, their boots crunching through the snow as they ventured deeper into the forest. The growl came again, this time closer. Henry raised a hand, signaling Hayes to stop. He knelt, examining the ground. Fresh tracks, large, clawed, and unlike anything he'd ever seen. "Whatever made these," he said, "it's big and fast." A sudden rustling in the underbrush made them both spin around, weapons raised. A shadow darted between the trees, too quick to get a clear look. "Stay close," Henry said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. They pressed on, the tracks leading them to a clearing. In the center stood an abandoned logging cabin, its roof caved in and walls blackened with age. The smell was stronger here, almost unbearable. "Looks like it's been empty for years," Hayes whispered. "Doesn't mean it's unoccupied now," Henry replied. They approached cautiously, stepping over debris and shattered glass. Inside, the air was stifling, thick with decay. Animal bones littered the floor, some gnawed clean, others broken as if something had fed on the marrow. And then they saw it. Carved into the wooden beams of the walls were symbols, crudely drawn, but their meaning was clear. A warning. Circles within circles, interspersed with jagged lines and strange runes. "What the hell is this?" Hayes asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Something ancient, Henry murmured, and not friendly. A low growl emanated from the shadows in the far corner of the cabin. They turned their flashlights toward the sound, the beams illuminating a figure that made Henry's blood run cold. It was humanoid but grotesquely twisted. Its skin was mottled and pale, stretched taut over elongated limbs. Its head was a horrific fusion of human and beast, with glowing yellow eyes that locked onto them with predatory intent. The creature's mouth opened, revealing rows of jagged teeth, and it let out a bone-chilling screech that sent Henry and Hayes stumbling backward. "Run!" Henry shouted, firing his rifle. The shot hit the creature square in the chest, but it barely flinched. They bolted from the cabin, the creature's thundering footsteps close behind. The forest seemed alive with movement, shadows darting at the edges of their vision. The creature howled again, the sound reverberating through the trees like a hunting horn. Henry tripped over a fallen branch, hitting the ground hard. Hayes turned back, firing her rifle at the creature to give him time to get up. "It's not going down!" she yelled. Henry scrambled to his feet. "Keep moving!" They reached a narrow ravine, the creature's guttural growls echoing behind them. Henry spotted a fallen tree forming a precarious bridge across the gap. "Over here!" he shouted, motioning for Hayes to follow. They scrambled across, the icy bark slick beneath their boots. Halfway across, the creature appeared at the edge of the ravine, its glowing eyes piercing through the fog. It roared, then leapt onto the log, its claws digging into the wood. The tree trembled under the weight, and Hayes nearly lost her footing. "Jump!" Henry yelled. They leapt to the other side just as the creature lunged after them. Henry grabbed a fallen branch and jammed it into the creature's path. The makeshift barrier sent it tumbling into the ravine with an enraged howl. They lay on the ground, gasping for breath, the silence of the forest slowly returning. Hayes looked at Henry, her face pale but determined. "Was that what's been taking people?" she asked. "One of them," Henry said grimly. "I think there's more." As they made their way back to Red Hollow, Henry couldn't shake the feeling that the forest was still watching them, its shadows hiding secrets older and darker than they could imagine. Whatever had awakened in those woods, it wasn't over. It had only begun. In the summer of 1987, Sarah Malone, a 29-year-old freelance photographer, set off on what she hoped would be a peaceful retreat into the wilderness of the Pacific Northwest. The past year had been grueling, filled with tight deadlines and personal upheavals, and Sarah craved solitude. She packed her camera, a notebook, and enough supplies to last a week, then drove deep into the forest, choosing an area that promised breathtaking views and complete isolation. Her destination was an old cabin she had found listed in an obscure travel guide. It was described as rustic but cozy, nestled in a remote corner of the forest, far from any towns or tourist trails. When she arrived, she found the description to be accurate. The cabin was simple, built from weathered wood and surrounded by towering pines. It looked as though it had been standing there for a century, untouched by time. Sarah spent her first day exploring the area, her camera clicking as she captured the sunlight streaming through the trees and the vibrant greens of the underbrush. The forest was alive with the sounds of birds and insects, a soothing symphony that helped her forget the stress she had left behind. That night, as she settled into bed, the peaceful atmosphere began to shift. The forest had grown eerily silent, the usual hum of nocturnal life replaced by an oppressive stillness. Sarah chalked it up to her overactive imagination and eventually drifted off to sleep. She woke abruptly in the middle of the night to a sound, a faint tapping on the cabin's wooden walls. It was soft and deliberate, like someone lightly knocking, moving from one side of the cabin to the other. Her heart pounded as she sat up in bed, straining to listen. "Probably just a branch in the wind," she muttered to herself, though the air outside had been completely still when she'd gone to bed. When the tapping ceased, she tried to go back to sleep, but unease kept her awake. The following morning, Sarah found nothing unusual around the cabin. No branches brushing the walls, no signs of animals. Shaking off her nerves, she decided to hike to a nearby stream she had spotted on her map. As she walked, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Several times she stopped and glanced over her shoulder, only to find nothing but the dense forest behind her. At the stream, she knelt to refill her water bottle when something caught her eye, a set of footprints in the muddy bank. The tracks were human but strange. The feet were longer than normal, with elongated toes that ended in sharp impressions, almost like claws. The prints led away from the stream, disappearing into the dense underbrush. Sarah's stomach churned as she stared at the tracks. Maybe someone else is out here. she told herself, though the isolation of the cabin was one of its selling points. She hurried back to the cabin, her mind racing with explanations. That night, the tapping returned. This time it was louder, more insistent. Sarah gripped the edge of her bed, her breath shallow as the sound circled the cabin. Suddenly, it stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl just outside the window. She froze, her blood running cold. The growl was unlike anything she had ever heard, deep and wet, like the sound of a predator savoring its next meal. Summoning her courage, she grabbed her flashlight and moved to the window, shining the beam into the darkness. At first, she saw nothing but trees. Then, just at the edge of the light, two glowing eyes stared back at her. They were unnaturally bright, reflecting the beam like a predator's but burning with an otherworldly intensity. The eyes blinked once, and then the shape they belonged to melted into the shadows. Sarah didn't sleep that night. She sat by the window, clutching a kitchen knife, her ears straining for any sound. Dawn finally broke, the light bringing some relief, though the memories of the eyes haunted her. Determined to leave, Sarah packed her things in a hurry. As she loaded her car, she noticed something scratched into the cabin's wooden door. "Don't leave." The letters were jagged, carved deep into the wood as if by claws. Fear gripped her, but she pushed it aside, climbing into the driver's seat and starting the engine. As the cabin disappeared in her rearview mirror, she felt a wave of relief until she spotted something in the road ahead. It was a figure, hunched and twisted, blocking her path. Its body was gaunt, its limbs impossibly long, and its head was tilted at an unnatural angle. The creature's eyes locked onto hers through the windshield, glowing even in the daylight. Sarah slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop mere feet from the figure. It didn't move, its gaze unrelenting. Panicking, she threw the car into reverse, but as she looked in the rearview mirror, she saw the same figure standing behind her. "No," she whispered, her voice trembling. The creature moved then, its head tilting even further, as if studying her. With no other options, Sarah turned the car sharply, plowing off the road and into the trees. Branches scraped against the windows as she navigated the uneven terrain, her heart pounding. Finally, she emerged onto another dirt road, her tires kicking up dust as she sped away. She didn't stop driving until she reached the nearest town. Hours later, at the local diner, she recounted her experience to a kind-faced waitress who listened intently, her expression darkening with every detail. "You're not the first," the waitress said quietly, glancing around as if afraid to be overheard. "People talk about that cabin. Strange things happen out there. Most don't come back." Sarah shuddered, her hands trembling as she gripped her coffee mug. "What was it, that thing I saw?" The waitress hesitated before answering. "They call it the Watcher. Some say it guards the forest, keeping people away from something or someone." Sarah left the diner with more questions than answers. She never returned to the cabin, but the memory of the glowing eyes and the creature's haunting presence stayed with her. Every night she triple-checked the locks on her doors and windows, and every shadow seemed to carry the weight of unseen eyes. Though she tried to move on, Sarah couldn't shake the feeling that the Watcher hadn't forgotten her. Sometimes, late at night, she would hear faint tapping on her apartment window, even on the 6th floor. She never looked, too afraid of what she might see staring back at her.